By the close of 1994, Doom had already expanded greatly as a franchise. Not only had gamers on PC got their hands on the original game and a sequel, several home console versions of the game had touched down already, opening the franchise up to many more people. The hype around Doom still hadn't died down, and the idea of it showing up on other consoles still excited. But Doom was a demanding game, requiring hardware that could run the game well and do it justice. The Jaguar was designed from the ground up to run 3D games, while Sega had to release a whole new add-on to the Genesis in order to make it happen. Both of these versions had compromises to get them in the door, so the idea of Super Nintendo, released in 1990, ever getting Doom in a similar way seemed far-fetched. It wasn't considered possible, even by Romero himself. But then one programmer with ambition took on the challenge, and that man was Randy Lyndon. A version of Doom that ran on 16-bit consoles and, with a bit of help from the Super FX2 chip, brought Doom to a Nintendo platform for the first time. It's fascinating, it's curious, it's a very unique beast of a Doom experience. This is the story of Doom on Super Nintendo. The release of the Famicom Home system in the Japanese market in July 1983 changed everything for Nintendo as a company. When the console released in 1985 to the North American market, it quickly became a sensation. Children the nation over wanted to get their hands on the Nintendo, and parents found themselves scrambling to get it under Christmas trees. The 8-bit console would go on to sell over 60 million consoles worldwide, with 34 million of those shipping in the North American region. Yet as the decade neared its end, Nintendo was forced to look to the future. Sega's Master System hadn't caught on in North America, selling only around 2 million units, but it had proven popular in Europe and Brazil. Sega struggled massively to compete with the NES in North America, while it also had to compete with the NEC PC engine and NES in Japan. So the company decided to get an early lead on the next generation and rushed the 16-bit Genesis to the market, releasing it in North America in late 1989. Its huge leap in graphical quality and aggressive ad campaign which specifically targeted Nintendo caught Nintendo flat-footed. This can mostly be attributed to the arrival of Michael Katz as Sega of America CEO. His experience working in other companies had gained him a reputation as a brass and combative executive. This went against Sega's polite Japanese management style, but it proved very effective. The director of marketing of Sega America, Al Nilsson, discussed this period of time, stating, "I knew that for every marketing dollar I had, Nintendo had 10. You didn't play video games back then, you played Nintendo. Sega was an afterthought. We couldn't go after their core audience, children. Peter Main, the head of marketing, basically said, just get the 6 to 12 year olds, that's all we need. So I looked at what we had that the Nintendo didn't, and it was our arcade heritage. Golden Axe, Space Harrier, these were Sega classics, and the Genesis system was the first console that could bring that arcade experience home. I looked at who was playing in the arcades, and this was back in the day when they were on every street corner, and it wasn't 6 to 12 year old boys, it was teenagers and young adults. They went there because that's where the best games were, and that's also where the girls were. I said, this is my market." Sega aggressively pursued licensed names and games, outbidding Nintendo for franchises from publishers like EA, and positioning themselves as the true alternate choice. By the end of 1990, kids wanted a Sega over Nintendo. It was the cool new kid in class and became a monstrous success. But Nintendo wasn't worried about this. The NES continued to sell well, and they wouldn't be rushed into releasing the NES's successor before its time. This delay allowed them to make the NES's successor a more powerful offering than the Genesis. It also allowed third-party developers to make games in time for the game's Japanese launch in 1990. The North American launch came in 1991. When the SNES released, the 16-bit gaming wars began, and it led to a boom period of 16-bit games that many still consider one of the greatest periods of gaming, even into the modern times. One ace in Super Nintendo's back pocket was Argonaut's game's Super FX chip. This chip was developed as a graphics coprocessor and allowed the Super Nintendo to enter the realm of basic 3D games. Not all game cartridges came with this attached, however. It was costly, and so only a handful of Super Nintendo games ever got to make use of it and its second iteration. But it allowed for some very impressive games to release towards the back end of the console's life that simply weren't possible on the native SNES hardware. The Super Nintendo also had Mode 7, which helped to create the illusion of 3D spaces more easily and was more widely used in games like F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, and The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. In the end, the Super Nintendo enjoyed great success and was only formally discontinued in North America in 1999, several years after the release of its successor console, the Nintendo 64. The Super Famicom in Japan would not be discontinued by Nintendo until 2003. Super Nintendo is heralded as one of the greatest game consoles of all time by many gamers. Its library of iconic games made it a strong fan favourite machine. The console has seen many of its titles re-released via the Wii Store, Wii U Store, and as part of the Nintendo Switch Online catalogue of classic games. There was even a release of a mini console that came bundled with 20 classic titles from the SNES's back catalogue. That sold incredibly well. The idea for Super Nintendo Doom had been briefly floated in the era id Software. However, the difficulty of working with Nintendo during the development of Super Nintendo Wolfenstein 3D had all but extinguished Carmack's interest in exploring such a port. Nintendo's rules around mature content proved to be a huge hindrance, and the amount of revisions, removals, and general censorship made the idea of doing the same to Doom a complete nightmare. Carmack hints at this version of SNES Doom when he stated in 1994, "I was slated to do a cut-down version of Doom for Super Nintendo SFX chip, but I kept thinking about how cool a Jaguar version of Doom would be, and Nintendo kept rejecting Wolfenstein SNES for bullshit reasons. A Golden Cross bonus item might offend Christians, right?" With Carmack moving on to develop Jaguar Doom, Super Nintendo owners would have to be content with only Wolfenstein 3D on the platform. That is until a man called Randy Lyndon put his mind to the task. He was convinced that Doom could be ported to the Super Nintendo and set about making that happen. Speaking to Gaming Reinvented in 2007, Randy stated, "Doom was a truly groundbreaking title, and I wanted to make it possible for gamers without a PC to play the game too. Doom on Super Nintendo was one of those programming challenges that I knew could be accomplished." Randy Lyndon is an accomplished programmer who would go on to develop the PlayStation 1 emulator Bleem. Even though he didn't have access to the id Software game files for Doom, that didn't stop him from pushing ahead with his port. He retrieved the assets he needed from the unofficial Doom spec by Matthew Fell, a spec that laid out the WAD format and how to get all the key files from it. Unfortunately, he could not use this method to extract the engine from the game. That would require a different solution entirely. Randy developed his own game engine called the Reality Engine, which would be used to house the game's files and assets in a form that could run on Nintendo's aging hardware. Soon after, he had a demo up and running and took it to Sculptured Software. I started the project independently and demoed it to Sculptured Software when I had a fully operational prototype running. A bunch of people at Sculptured helped complete the game so it could be released in time for the holidays. Sculptured Software mailed a SNES prototype cartridge to id Software with no pretense or fanfare. When Romero and the team received the cartridge, they put it into their SNES and were amazed. It was Doom running on the Super Nintendo. "Oh my god, Doom is on the Super Nintendo," Romero reportedly remarked. He would later recount in an interview, "They reverse engineered it and sent it to us, and we said, okay, we'll get this published." That was probably one of the rare times a company decided to do a port and then just did it for free. We didn't even think to do a Super Nintendo version of Doom. That hardware was absolutely not made for 3D. Super Nintendo was good for horizontal scrolling, parallax effects, and all that stuff, but Mode 7 was as crazy as it got. id Software themselves were actually very busy with the process of developing Quake in 1995, so they were unable to deploy the entire team to help out with the port. To speed things along, Sandy Peterson worked on converting levels from the PC version of Doom to fit on the Super Nintendo. "I was told to do it by John Carmack. He and I were the only people who worked on Super Nintendo Doom did. I was basically the only level designer." Peterson's role was simple: strip out everything that wasn't essential and bring the resource requirements down as much as possible. This meant removing textures where possible, reducing complex textures like lava or toxic to single solid colours, and also paring down architecture, which was almost entirely removed to reduce polygon count. In Super Nintendo Doom, the roof and floors are rendered as solid blocks of colour rather than textures to save on performance. The Super Nintendo only had 600KB RAM, so these alterations were important to gain the game running at all. The Super FX chip was capable, however it was pushed to its limits by Doom. This was not an exclusive problem to Doom, as the Star Fox game, that also made heavy use of the Super FX chip, also had to reduce its resolution. Instead of the SNES's native 256 by 224 resolution, Doom employed a 216 by 176 resolution, with only 144 of those pixels being rendered in the 3D canvas. The rest was reserved for the status bar. The Reality Engine also duplicated vertical lines, effectively rendering Doom out at 108 by 144 resolution. This is why Super Nintendo Doom has a very chunky look. Even with these compromises, the game struggled to get over 10 frames per second. Further compromises were necessary. One particular issue that arose was that the Super Nintendo was too underpowered to have that many large spaces on screen at once. Having large rooms that overlooked other large rooms was a huge problem for the console, and Peterson discussed this, stating, "I do remember that the levels with levels that looked outside was a massive pain, because you could always see too many polys. Showing two giant rooms at once was impossible, so I put vision traps in the halls. If I had two big rooms next to each other, the hall between them made a little crook neck, like a sink trap, so you could never see both rooms at once. Even with these tricks utilised, certain levels had to be cut outright. E2M2 had way too many boxes in it. Boxes were geometry that the game had to create, and so Peterson decided to remove the level entirely. E2M7 had too many windows looking into large rooms or outdoors, so that level was also cut. In total, 5 levels are missing from the original version of Doom, leading to 22 levels being included at all. It should be noted that no levels from Die Flash Consumed were ever considered for this version of Doom. What is interesting though is that this version of console Doom does not make use of the Jaguar level set. Instead, a lot of the levels have more texture variety and in some cases are much closer to the PC originals of the levels. Other cuts to the core gameplay were made by Sculpted Software in pursuit of getting extra performance out of the Super Nintendo. Single-sided enemies were one feature necessitated by this process. It saved having to have multiple sprites for each enemy on the ROM, but it also meant that players could no longer sneak up on enemies, who would always be facing the player. Interestingly, Sculpted Software hadn't altered the monster's internal logic, or made them aware of the player even though they can't see them from great distances. Peterson mentioned this in the same interview, and he believes this was done to avoid accidentally pushing the difficulty of the game up, as enemies would relentlessly chase the player. The game also removes most enemy sounds, infighting and sound propagation. All enemies are deaf and wake up when they see the player, not when the player shoots a weapon. The way some weapons behave has also been altered. The shotgun, for example, no longer has a spread of bullets but instead behaves more like a sniper rifle at long range. Peterson never got to play the Super Nintendo version of Doom during its development. The port was developed by Sculpted Software across the country, and all he could do was reduce the levels and send them off. He never knew if the port was on track or not, stating, "I feel sorry for Sculpted Software to have to do all that work with literally no one from id helping them out. I mean, I would have helped if I could, but once I did the levels, I got back to making Doom and Quake levels. We were a tiny little company after all, with limited personnel." When asked about the number of cut levels and features from the game, Randy admits that there's a lot he wishes he could have put back in the game. Unfortunately, the game used the largest capacity ROM available and it filled almost completely. I vaguely remember that there were roughly 16 bytes free, so there wasn't any more space available anyway. However, I did manage to include support for Super Scope, mouse and X-Band modem. Yes, you could actually play against someone online. Romero commented on the Super Nintendo port of Doom in 2020, stating in an interview with Shack News, "We were really surprised. We didn't think the Super Nintendo could do it, but incredibly, that was so many people's first exposure to Doom." Doom on Super Nintendo was given an M rating, one of the few handed out on Super Nintendo in its lifespan. Super Nintendo Doom will be released in the US on September 1st, 1995, published by Williams Entertainment. In the US, it got a special red Super Nintendo casing, which made it stand out from many of its contemporary games. It's important when discussing Super Nintendo Doom to keep in mind how ambitious this version of the game actually is. While Super Nintendo had the capability to run 3D games, those games were not the main focus of the platform. Doom was arguably the most ambitious game to land on the system, a 3D game that required lots of action and variety in enemies, all playing out in huge 3D rooms which were varied in size. So of course this version of Doom is going to have its compromises to get through the door, and compromises it comes packing, but that doesn't make this version awful. In fact, when you look at what they squeezed in, the package itself is very impressive. It has almost all of the original 3 episodes of Doom, bar 5 levels, 22 levels in total. It has a larger roster of enemies than the 32X or Jaguar versions, including Cyber Demons and Spider Masterminds who make their console debuts in this version of the game. Not only this, the game comes packing X-Band multiplayer, which allowed Super Nintendo consoles to link up via phone lines and play deathmatch across the internet in 1995. It sadly doesn't feature any kind of local multiplayer though, which is a bit disappointing. The levels here are arguably more complex than those found in the Jaguar or 32X versions of Doom, retaining more texture variety and a lot more of the original Doom's layout. I would say that this version from a visual perspective is much closer to the PC original than its console cousins, which is pretty wild when you think about it. This version also has a very fun interpretation of the Doom soundtrack, delivering an excellent backing that not only feels like the original tracks from the PC version but also stomps the 32X and Jaguar soundtracks. Most of Doom 1's music makes the jump, and I feel it's one of the features that makes this port really stand out. It also features all the weapons from Doom, and they're all still fun to use, even if some of them have been altered in how they behave. The changes to the rocket launcher, shotgun and plasma rifles are subtle but noticeable. Unfortunately, as ambitious as this port is, it ultimately falls to its knees at times from the weight of what it's being asked to achieve. Put simply, performance is pretty mediocre. Whether playing on real hardware or in an emulator, Super Nintendo does not enjoy its time with Doom, and that translates into a very rocky experience for the player. Enter a medium-sized room filled with a handful of enemies, and the experience can very quickly resemble a PowerPoint presentation. The frame rate just isn't stable, so things can move from bearable to intolerable with little notice. The problem with this is that it impacts the rest of the gameplay experience. Controlling ThatNukemGuy on Super Nintendo can be a pretty traumatic experience. Not only does he catch on walls a lot more than he does in other versions, awkwardly leading to the player needing to unstick themselves, but general movement just feels very cumbersome. ThatNukemGuy isn't as slick to move in this version, and even with the strafing ability at hand, avoiding incoming fireballs is less intuitive and more frustrating. There's also a slight delay to inputs, and it can make moving around this version feel like you're wading through knee-high custard. This is made worse by the fact that the frame rate tanks because movement becomes even harder and the game stutters to a stall. The game is very temperamental in that sense, and unfortunately there's very little the player can do to remedy this. I'd also say that combat just isn't as fun in this outing. The changes to the enemies only add to this. Much like in 32X Doom, enemies stagger weirdly towards you and you just have to get used to it. A lot of the core Doom components are missing from enemies, and so the experience feels a bit different for my liking. Another issue is that because the game is rendered at such a low resolution, enemies in the distance really do have a habit of disappearing in the mid-horizon. It can make it really hard to scope out larger rooms as you try to figure out if the seemingly empty room is actually empty or if there's just a bunch of enemies standing just out of your field of view. From a visual standpoint, it also means a lot of the bigger rooms really do smudge into very ugly spaces, so if you're looking to see Doom at its best, this isn't the best version for that. Another awkward omission is the complete lack of a save system. Unlike 32X, where the player is given the option to jump to levels at will, here you're forced to play from the start of the episodes each time you boot into the game. It's an odd omission for sure, and it makes you wonder why they didn't include a password system or such. Also, somewhat bizarrely, in some versions of this game, certain episodes are locked behind difficulty levels. If you want to experience the whole of Doom on Super Nintendo, you'll need to get good and fast. As I say in these retrospectives, I highly doubt many people who picked this up in 1995 on Super Nintendo actually cared about a lot of these issues. Doom landing on Super Nintendo was a status moment. It was a moment where Super Nintendo gamers could gloat that their console got a copy of Doom that, on paper, is more feature complete than the previous console outings. It was also a showcase for how versatile Doom could be. If you could get used to the quirks of this version and didn't come from the PC version, I suspect a lot of people would have been happy with what they were given here. The fact that it landed on Super Nintendo and didn't require an add-on to the console made it instantly accessible to millions of people, and I'd hazard a guess that this version sold monstrously well on Super Nintendo. And the important thing here, perspective is key. While this is among the weaker offerings of Doom on console, that doesn't steal from the overall package here. Doom on Super Nintendo should be viewed as a technical marvel let down by the limitations of the platform they tried to squeeze it onto. It's generally considered among the weaker ways to experience classic Doom, and while it has garnered curiosity from the general gaming world, most in the modern times view it more as a novelty than an essential part of Doom's legacy. For many people though, this was their first experience with Doom and it's fondly remembered. Sales figures were never officially released for this version of Doom, however it wouldn't surprise me if the game sold very well. Linden themselves has stated as such a few years back in interviews. In 2024, the full Super Nintendo Doom source code was rediscovered on floppy disks and uploaded to the internet. In 2024, it was announced that Limited Run Games would be creating an enhanced version of Super Nintendo Doom to be made playable on actual hardware. This enhanced version would not only feature all the cut levels, but also levels from the 4th episode, Thy Flesh Consumed. This is currently being worked on at the time this video is being made. Doom on Super Nintendo is such a fascinating beast. The fact that it was willed into existence not by id Software themselves but by one man with a vision endears it greatly to me. In 1995, Super Nintendo did what more capable consoles could not: play Doom, and that's crazy to say. Of course, better versions would release, and the internet has not been super kind to Super Nintendo Doom in the years since its release, but I think a lot of those reviews miss the point. This version of Doom was the Doom experience for a whole host of people, and I'm very glad that it exists. Of course, with the imminent release of the Super Nintendo updated version from Limited Run Games, it's likely we'll see the true potential of Super Nintendo Doom finally achieved. But I also think that this version deserves its place in Doom Legacy and is probably the most impressive of all the console ports for how much it strived to achieve, even if that striving was hampered by poor frame rate.